Shalom everyone, welcome back. So last week we learned about how the Jewish people seem to have gotten it worse. Now the Egyptians can't, we were just obeying orders because every Egyptian has now started beating the Jews because they have to collect the straw, the hay from all the different fields. And when the Egyptians see them coming into their fields, they're going and beating them. And so the Jewish suffering just went up a notch. And just when it seems like it can't get any worse, this is when it's going to start getting better. And Hashem tells us the famous 4 terms of freedom. V'otzeiti etchem, I'm going to take you out of Egypt. You will physically leave. V'tzalti etchem me'avodatam, the work will stop. Now, v'ga'alti etchem v'lakachti etchem, I will save you, I will redeem you, I will take you to be my nation, you will receive my Torah. So we have an evolvement of freedom. Our freedom really begins when Moshe Rabbeinu convinces Pharaoh that he will get the best work out of the Jews if he gives them one day off. Yismach Moshe b'matnat cherko. Moshe could rejoice that he gained us one day off. He convinced Paro that we will be a much better worker if he gives us one day off. So we start having Shabbos. As the plagues will hit, after the 5th plague, it will be Rosh Hashanah. It will be around September, the beginning of the Jewish year, the first of the month of Tishrei, and the Egyptians will give up. We're going to stop working in our Parsha, meaning the servitude comes to an end after the 5th plague. After Dever, after the powerful plague where pestilence, the Egyptian animals drop dead, the Egyptians give up. So even though we haven't gotten free from Egypt, in our Parsha, the workload will stop. And eventually, as we will learn in next week's Parsha, we will reach complete freedom as we leave Egypt on Pesach, on the first day of Pesach. So let's begin our story. So Hashem tells Moshe, don't worry, Paro's going to harden his heart over and over again. He's not going to agree. And I'm going to hit the Egyptians with the 10 plagues. Now, Moshe had a staff made of sapphire, which had come out of the Garden of Eden. And on that staff was engraved Detzach Adash Ba'achav, which is the acronym of the 10 plagues that the Egyptians are going to get. Dam, the first plague. When the Egyptians refused to let the Jews go, so Hashem will hit their deity. They believe the Nile is their god. That all the Egyptian sustenance comes from the Nile. So the plague of Dam hits. It is a year before we leave Egypt. The plagues will take place in 12 months. They'll take place during the course of a year. So a year before we leave Egypt, the first plague hits, and the Egyptian waters all turn to blood. Now the fish die, people don't have what to drink, and everyone's suffering. But the sorcerers go and buy water from other countries, and they say, we can do this trick too. And so they show, we can do it too. They turn that water into blood using their sorcery or their trickery or their whatever. The next plague is going to be Tzfardeya. If on the first plague, Pharaoh had a way out because Pharaoh could drink wine. Pharaoh, he's king. So the first plague didn't affect him directly. When it came to the plague of frogs, the frogs jumped into his bed. You ever try going to sleep when there's a little bit of dirt in your bed is grungy? Well, Pharaoh had slimy frogs jumping on his face, jumping into his pajamas, jumping into his mouth, jumping into his food, and no one could protect him. Because as much as his servants tried beating the frogs, they were all over Egypt. So Pharaoh wasn't very royal, having frogs jumping into his clothing and into his mouth. And here Pharaoh had said, I'm a god, I run the show, I could stand up to God. He couldn't stand up to anything. He couldn't beat this plague. And now Pharaoh says, okay, guys, I'm going to let you go. So Moshe says, when do you want the plague to stop? So Pharaoh thinks, he must be able to get it to stop now. Must be that according to the stars, Moshe, who grew up in our house, he knows stargazing. He must know that the plague is going to end now. So Paro says, tomorrow. He thinks he's going to outsmart Moshe. So Moshe says, Kidvaracha, as you wish. You want to suffer another night just to prove your point? No problem. So the plague will end tomorrow. So the Egyptians suffer one more day, and then the plague really stops as Moshe prays for the plague to stop. The next plague is Kinim. Now, the sorcerers would replicate every plague. When it came to the plague of Kinim, they tried and they couldn't. Hashem said, I'm going to show you, you can't run the show. So, although, according to their skill set, they thought they could replicate this plague, it didn't work for them. They said to Pharaoh, this is the hand of God. We should have been able to do this. So Egypt is attacked by lice. Now the lice were like the size of an olive. You're talking about huge lice. And everyone's standing scratching all over, and they can't stop it. All of the earth is covered with lice. And again, obviously Pharaoh has no protection. All his people are covered with lice. All of Egypt is suffering. So the first 2 plagues had a warning before they hit, and the third one did not. This was the style of the plagues. 2 with a warning, the third not. So we've hit the plague of Kinim. Then we have the plague of Arov. Wild animals attack Egypt. Moshe tells Pharaoh, you should know, the next plague is going to start in your castle. When these wild animals stampede into Egypt, they go straight for Pharaoh's castle. They destroy his castle. And only after they've taken down, so to speak, the leadership of Egypt, do these elephants and lions and tigers and every type of animal start stampeding all around Egypt. Now, the Jews aren't bothered by these plagues. You go to Jewish territory, everything's fine. And so the Egyptians and the Jews start understanding, whoa, wait, God is on the Jews' side. This is something that's happening to us as a punishment. The next plague is considered Hashem's power hand, where Hashem causes all the cattle of Egypt to drop dead. Dever. And after this plague, the Egyptians give up. The common man in Egypt says, I cannot force the Jews to work. I understand God is running the show. Because Moshe had told them, you're going to see, not a single Jewish animal will die, and all the Egyptian cattle will die. So Pharaoh goes to check. He sends his men. They check throughout the Jewish quarters. No Jewish animal died. Next comes the plague of Shechin. The Egyptians would not allow the Jews to bathe themselves. So the Jews had all kinds of skin problems because they couldn't wash normally. So Hashem punished the Egyptians, just like every plague was midah keneged midah. Hashem was paying back the Egyptians for what they did to the Jews. So now the Egyptians broke out in boils. Now these were boils that were uncurable. So the Egyptians not only were scratching and bleeding, but all of Egypt was sitting in a high fever, and they couldn't do anything. They couldn't function. Pharaoh, his advisors, his sorcerers, everyone's out of commission. Everyone's sick. So of course Pharaoh comes begging, stop this, I'll let you go. And of course, once the plague passes, so Pharaoh goes back on his word. And our Parsha ends with the plague of hail, which was, again, you remember we said, Ditzach, Adash, so boils was without a warning, and then the plague of hail, Barad, there was a warning, and Pharaoh did not give in, of course. The hail comes down, huge boulders, fire mixed with water that's frozen, so you had these balls of ice, and in the middle there was fire, and when they come down, they destroy all the crops. So if the Egyptian economy was destroyed because the cattle all dropped dead in Dever, now all the Egyptian growth is being destroyed because all the trees are being destroyed. And Hashem put in a caveat. He said, anyone who respects my word and goes into any home or any tent or any hut will be protected. And Hashem gave this caveat twice. One with the plague of pestilence and one with the plague of Barad, where Hashem was twisting the Egyptians' hands and saying, you want to deny my existence? Go out. You go for a walk, leave your kids out, leave your cattle out, and see what happens. You want to trust that I'm running the show? Bring your cattle in, bring your families in, and whoever will be in a home will be protected. And this was unnatural because the boulders that came down, the Dever, the plague of pestilence, should have hit equally, regardless of where you were. But if a person was respectful of Hashem's word, if a person was willing to say, I recognize Hashem's running the world, so then they were spared, even among the Egyptians. And here, Pharaoh's heart is hardened once again. And although Pharaoh had said during the plague of hail, I will let you go, our Parsha concludes where once again, Pharaoh is being stubborn, and he will learn his lesson, as we will see in next week's Parsha. Shabbat Shalom.